Welcome back to the Righteous Kimstones, the series where I'm telling you about how the Kardashians have historically made a pathway for Christian nationalism in America. So now we're going into the part of my deep dive where I'm covering Kris Jenner and her side of the family. And I wanted to go back centuries with this deep dive to show you how Christian nationalism is baked into the DNA of America and America's celebrity culture. And I mean that quite literally. Now, with deep dives about the Kardashians, people usually go back to Kris or maybe to MJ, but I'm taking this one back all the way to the 1700s. And this is where I tell you that this is all for entertainment purposes, and most of the information that I've gotten about her genealogy I found from websites online. I am not a genealogist. This is just for funsies. In the beginning of this series, I told you about Robert Kardashian and his Armenian lineage. And honestly, I thought that would be a little bit harder to research just because so much was happening in Armenia, so much was destroyed in the genocide. So I didn't think I'd be able to find as much information as I thought I could, but it was honestly harder to find information on Kris Jenner's side of the family. Some of those genealogy websites have traced Kris's lineage all the way back to Plymouth Rock and then some, and that's a lot of different family members, and I'm not going to talk about all of them. I actually just wanted to tell you about 4 of them, and 3 of them lived during the same time in the same part of America. Okay, picture it. It's the literal Little House on the Prairie. It's about 1753, and we're a couple years out from the 7-Year War happening in America, which is the war that leads to the American Revolution. And it's the first global war of any kind. And it's all based around colonization, from England and France kind of fighting over who gets to colonize North America. But there's English settlers here, and they're all settled in the same area. And I'm going to tell you about a couple of them because it makes so much sense, because they're so much like the Kardashian family we know today. This information is important to the story. So the 7-Year War was basically where Native people were getting wiped out by the French and the English, and all of them were trying to con the Native people into giving up their land, or they're being tricked and being taken out. This was devastating for my tribe, especially the Cherokee tribe and other tribes like Cree in this area, because we lost land, we lost Native people, we lost indigenous practices, and these British people, their whole mission was to literally whitewash America. Kris's ancestors during this time had come from Puritan colonizers who came to the New World in the 1600s, who believed that it was their divine mission to conquer and colonize this land. It was the same spirit that fueled them while they fought in the 7-Year War. And the 7-Year War was a brutal battle where Britain and France weren't just fighting for land, they were fighting for religious domination over North America. The 7-Year War was a genocidal project aimed at clearing indigenous people from the land for white Christian colonization. And this was the first global conflict in history, and they were all pretty much fighting over North America and other lands they wanted to colonize across the globe. This period in America's history was a catastrophe for indigenous peoples' alliances, and it destroyed their power to negotiate between European powers. They cleared the land and left it bloodstained to make room for British colonial expansion. This was genocidal land theft. And then boom, the American Revolution happened. So this was the first war for America on the soil of the Americas. And during this time, we don't have an army. It's not America yet. So there's British armies and French army men who are coming here, but mostly it's the people who settled in the colony who are basically putting on tactical gear and cosplaying as soldiers so they can go out and slaughter Native people to make room for more Christian nationalism. I mean, the first of its kind. Okay, now that that's out of the way, I'm going to tell you about these 3 family members of Kris Jenner's during this time. And it's very appropriate that her side of the family at the time was called the Whites. So I'm going to tell you about Colonel Jonathan White and his wife, Esther White. So Colonel Jonathan White wasn't a real colonel in the army, like I was saying before. He would basically be someone who dresses up in tactical gear to go out and commit crimes against Native people. And then his wife considered herself to be a holy woman, and she was kind of the first ever Tradwife influencer. And basically, the Christian school in the center of town was a place where the women and children would go during the day, and they were looking down on anything that would be considered savage or savagery. This was a true whitewashing of the people in the area and making sure that they had no empathy for the people who were indigenous to that land being slaughtered around them. And it was basically Esther's job to set a standard of morality that was not attainable, but that everyone would want to achieve. So she really was like the first Tradwife influencer on the colony. So Colonel Jonathan White has a brother that also lives in this colony, and that's Deacon Josiah White. This isn't him, but this is a drawing of somebody that kind of looks like what he would look like during that time. And Deacon Josiah White, you would think, oh, is he a preacher or priest? No, he just owned the land that the church was on. And then everyone looked to him for moral superiority and to see what he was doing, because it obviously had to be very holy because he owned the church. Who does that sound like? Does that sound anything like California Community Church to you? There's also a Josiah White who pops up later in history, about 100 years from this point in time, who has a residential school for mixed children and indigenous children to whitewash them. And I don't know if there's a direct correlation in, the family tree, but seeing as that's what her early ancestors were doing on the colony as they were making way for what would become America, I mean, it sounds like it fits right in with whatever was happening on that side of the family. So yeah, it sounds like Kris's ancestors were a Tradwife influencer, a fake preacher who owned the church and profited off of it, and a weirdo dressed up in tactical gear to go make sure he could profit off of and colonize indigenous people practices, things like that. Now, wait till I tell you about the serial killer that pops up in their family tree about 100 years from now. Stay tuned for that one. That'll be in part 2. I went back in time and looked at the Kardashians' lineage, and I think you will believe what I found. Because if I told you they had an ancestor who was a prolific con artist, I think you'd believe it. And what if I told you that that same ancestor was terrible to employees? I think you'd believe it. And what if I told you that very same ancestor built an empire on being a fraud? Ooh, I fear you'd believe it. Okay, this is the last one. But if I told you that same ancestor designed what they called a murder castle, well, I think you'd believe it, right? Now, this is all for entertainment purposes, but I went back and looked at one of those lineage websites, and they connected H.H. Holmes, the first American serial killer, to the Kardashians. And honestly, it kind of made sense. Dr. H.H. Holmes' story takes place in the Gilded Age of America. This is where being a millionaire actually meant you were a celebrity. This is, of course, before radio, TV, movies. So millionaires were the celebrities of this time. And H.H. Holmes wanted to be one of those millionaires at any cost. H.H. Holmes was a notorious fraudster who thought his place was at the top. This is the beginning of oligarchies forming in America, and the biggest celebrity around is Andrew Carnegie, who's just a rich businessman. And H.H. Holmes was committing fraud left and right. He rolled into town and he started immediately digging up corpses and selling them to medical facilities. And because he was a pharmacist, I mean, this is the kind of pharmacy where they used to put blow cane in the Coca-Cola. So this was a long time ago, and he was a different kind of pharmacist. He was out grave robbing so he could sell the cadavers to medical facilities for them to run experiments on. Very not on the up and up whatsoever. And he ended up committing insurance fraud and using those bodies to do that. But for a while, he was running a hell of a racket because he built what was called a murder castle. So Chicago is really the first concept of a city that has popped up in America because of the World's Fair. There are people coming from all over to be around the World's Fair for jobs or opportunities. And H.H. Holmes sees this. He, of course, is there for the same reason. And he walks into town, he's walking around, he sees a pharmacy that he just wants to own it. He goes in and talks to the owner. It's a little old lady, and recently her husband had passed away. He charms her because everyone tells these stories about how charming H.H. Holmes was, and he charmed his way out of getting caught so many times. And he talks to this woman and says, "I'll be like your long lost son. Sell your pharmacy to me and I'll take care of it." And so she did. And then the woman disappeared. No one knew where she went. And H.H. starts telling this story about how she left and moved to California. No one heard or saw of her again. Most people think that she became a victim of H.H. Holmes, maybe his first in Chicago. Across the street from the pharmacy is an empty lot. And in that empty lot is where H.H. Holmes would build his future murder castle, which is this building here. Now, H.H. Holmes had a lot of plans for his hotel that he was building, and almost none of them involved paying staff or paying for those building materials. He had cons at every angle as he was building this hotel, and he didn't want one person to know all of his plans, like one big blueprint, seeing everything he had planned, because this building was basically like a lethal game of chutes and ladders. He had mostly women staying there. There never seemed to be rooms for men, but there always was a room for a lady. So women would come to town to go to the World's Fair to maybe get a job or meet a husband. They would end up checking into his hotel and then they would not check out. Now, there are some historians and relatives of H.H. Holmes that insinuated that he could possibly also be Jack the Ripper, but just in the last year, I believe, we got DNA evidence that proved who Jack the Ripper was, and it was not H.H. Holmes. Now, during this time in the Gilded Age, people did just disappear. Sometimes people would get on a boat and go to Europe and you wouldn't hear from them for months at a time, or maybe something else, unfortunately, would happen to them and their family and friends just wouldn't hear from them. And so I think because of this, H.H. Holmes got away with taking the lives of upwards of 200 people is what's speculated. And then he finally got caught, and you know what they got him with? Insurance fraud. After all that, insurance fraud. Now, of course, this is just a genealogy website online, and who knows how accurate it is. And of course, this is all just for entertainment purposes. But it is interesting that out of all of the people in true crime, that it would connect the Kardashian-Jenner family to H.H. Holmes, when most of his crimes that he got caught for, at least, were around conning people, grifting people, and he was a pharmacist, so he was trying to sell like wellness tonics and things like that. I just think that it's interesting that that would be the one they're connected to, allegedly. Kris Jenner's lineage is pretty long, so I am skipping around a little bit, but in the next section of The Devil Works Hard, Kris Jenner Works Harder, we're going to talk a little bit more about Kris's more immediate family, so stay tuned. And I will be posting this as one longer series on my YouTube, Livy Smalls, so follow me there if you want to. If I may, I'd like to lay out a little timeline for all of us to follow along with for entertainment purposes or whatever. So Kris Kardashian at the time cheats on her husband with her trainer, and that relationship didn't work out, even though it blew up her whole family and her husband divorced her. So she needed to find her next meal ticket, and she thought that meal ticket was going to be Caitlyn Jenner, the Olympian. But when she got together with Caitlyn, even though Caitlyn was very hot, she was broke. So she had about $200 to her name. That is not going to do for Kris Jenner, who loves money. So she's going to make sure that everybody is working full throttle to make money for the family. And honey, she's trying everything. She even pops up in the later 90s with an infomercial selling these spiritual candles, talking about how spiritual she is. Now let's jump ahead a little bit. Keeping Up with the Kardashians first aired October 14th, 2007. Prior to this, Kris and Caitlyn Jenner had dealt with some financial instability. They weren't broke, but they didn't have consistent income. Before the show, Kris and Caitlyn were worried about paying their bills. Kris said so herself in her book. So this was a time that they were taking any measures necessary to build the foundation for what Kris's media empire would be. Now, previous to October 14th, 2007, the only reason people know Kim Kardashian is because of her friendship with Paris Hilton and the tape she made with Ray J. Norwood. And in 2008, Sonia Norwood, Brandy and Ray J's mother, sued Kim Kardashian and her siblings because they stole over $120,000 from her using her credit card. So were Kim, Kourtney, Khloe, and Rob Jr. running up a bill at the Gucci store? No. This was money that was being spent over the years between 2004 and 2007 at the Dash and Smooch stores that Kim Kardashian and her siblings and her mother owned. Sonia Norwood said that Kim Kardashian was working for her as a stylist and she took the credit card, and she says that Kim gave the credit card information to her siblings and probably her mother because her mom owned the Smooch store, which was a kids clothing store, and then the girls owned the Dash stores, and all of these payments were happening in the Smooch and the Dash stores. Now, why would they need to be making payments in their own stores on a stolen credit card from Ray J's mother? And it's interesting that Ray J's mom sued the kids, but not Kris, when Kris's store was clearly involved. Now, this all got settled out of court around 2009, but still there's so many questions about what was going on here. So 2009, that gets settled, and that is the same year that Kris Jenner starts her very own Beverly Hills Bible study group. Now, we've talked about the ones that she attended in the 70s with celebrities and televangelists, and it's the beginning of a bunch of different cults and mega churches. So she learned from the best. Why not start a Bible study group in your house that you could eventually parlay into a church, which she did. Okay, so now Kris has the church. She has the congregation. She's going to need a shady pastor who will look the other way if she's doing something nefarious with the money coming in through the church. Who could she find except for Brad Johnson, who once was a cool guy preacher, but at this point in time was currently going through a scandal that left him down on his luck. He was ousted as the cool guy preacher, getting divorced from his wife just because he did a little nose candy and had some extramarital affairs and some other things. So now he's working at Starbucks and he is at the end of his rope emotionally, and he's desperate. Kris and Caitlyn Jenner come through his line at Starbucks. They seek him out and they say, let's get out of here. You could run our congregation. Next thing you know, they're putting Brad Johnson and his frosted tips on TV for the world to see to rehab that image. And nothing justifies a pastor like a pastor that's been on TV. So they put him on TV to officiate this very quick wedding that came out of nowhere. And they put him front and center in all of the wedding footage. There's even headlines later that he might officiate Kanye and Kim's wedding, again to justify his presence. And around that same time, Kim Kardashian is saying, I tithe 10% of my income to the church. She doesn't really say it's the family church at first, but it eventually comes out that she tithes 10% of her income to her mother's church that has a shady pastor. Now, there are rumors about California Community Church and their congregation. People don't really know who attends this church because pretty much everyone in the family goes to some version of Church Home, Hillsong, Calvary, some celebrity-driven church. And maybe that's to recruit new people or to make sure that they're tied to other churches. But they are still in this network of churches doing something weird behind the scenes. And then a few years later, Kanye starts doing Sunday service, and then he starts the Donda Academy after that. And it's said to be around 2019 when Kris links up with Lou Taylor, but I have a feeling it was earlier than that because I'm pretty sure Brad knew Lou Taylor from Calvary Church. Calvary, I need to do a whole other series on because it's like black mold. It's like this church that is in all of these other little churches and cults and groups. But Calvary is a link to all of these people, and it links all of these churches that are Pentecostal or non-denominational that really thrive on bringing money in, and that money benefits only celebrities or Christian nationalism and not anyone in the area like who would need help from a church. So it's just very interesting how all of these dots tend to line up, isn't it? I just thought I would share that with everyone for no reason at all. And I am still working on my Kris Jenner series. It's going to be out soon. I've hit a little roadblock with some things. It's really interesting how there's little information on her family. So I'm having to do some extra research, but it's coming. Did Kris Jenner's family own a plantation? This is a question I've gotten a few times on my videos, so I did a deep dive into her parents' genealogy to find out. Kris's mom, Mary Jo Campbell, or MJ's side of the family tree, just gave birth dates, places that they were born, and very little information. So this is what I have surmised just using geographical history and genealogy combined with obituaries. The Campbell family would be surprised to see how lavish their Kardashian ancestors are living because they were dirt poor. And here I drew a little line following the pattern of migration of the Campbell family and how they went from settlers around Plymouth Rock all the way to San Diego, California. So Kris Jenner's mom, MJ's maiden name was Campbell, and the Campbell surname is found on slave registries in the South. But there is a pattern of names and birthplaces that make me think that they were not part of the slave-owning class, but it looks like they most likely supported people who enslaved people, looking at the names and the birthplaces. You can see a pattern in the birth dates and birthplaces from North Carolina to Kentucky to Missouri. So in North Carolina, her ancestors likely arrived after the land grab and there was no good farmland left. So they went to Kentucky because Kentucky has been advertised as this prime frontier post-Revolutionary War with rich soil and open land. And then they arrive for all of that good land and it's been spoken for. So that rich land that they were promised in Kentucky was mostly given away using land grants to wealthy migrants. So the rich had already come up and scooped it all up. So the next move was to Missouri, which was supposed to be the next promised land. So the Ozarks and rural areas were not yet dominated by slaveholders. So they most likely saw Missouri as a place they could still buy farmland and not need to enslave people. Not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't afford it. So even though rich people were making it harder for the Campbells because they were having to migrate state to state to state to try to find a piece of land that they could work and farm and make a living, they still were in favor of the Confederacy. And you can tell in these names here of the children that were born during this time. In my research, it became very obvious to me that Kris Jenner comes from a long line of people who were dirt poor hillbillies that worshiped the rich class. So they were like those hillbilly people who worship billionaires today, basically. And I say that because there is a pattern of names and birthplaces. For example, Jefferson Davis Campbell was born in Missouri during the Civil War by one of MJ's relatives. Named after Jefferson Davis, the only Confederate president who was president during the Confederacy while they were fighting in the Civil War. Now, the Campbells didn't have any dog in that fight. They were living in Missouri. They were not part of the Civil War at all, but they were still naming their kids after the Confederacy president. It was like bootlicking the boot that's actually crushing you because you've had to migrate over and over and over again because of these rich people who are enslaving people and owning plantations and pushing the poor people out to the corners of the country to try to make a farm and a living for themselves and their families. And I just want to go back to this pattern of migration that I've made this little line on the map using birthplaces and birth dates. It really shows that if they had enslaved people or owned a plantation, they probably would have stayed put, because moving that many enslaved people or a plantation or a farming operation to different states as the Civil War is going on would be very difficult. For example, the Nottoway plantation that just burned down over the weekend, coward John Randolph, who moved from Louisiana to Virginia to enslave upwards of 200 African artisans and people to build the Nottoway plantation in Louisiana. So as the Civil War moved closer to his plantation, he abandoned his wife and kids in the middle of a Civil War war zone because he thought his plantation would be spared if only women and children were there. So he took around 200 enslaved people to Texas to evade them learning about their freedom. John Randolph is one of the reasons we celebrate Juneteenth, because he brought those enslaved people to Texas to keep them from learning about their emancipation and the Emancipation Proclamation. So by the time word finally reached Texas to let those enslaved people know that they were free to go, they were the last of the enslaved people to learn about their freedom. And that happened June 19th, 1865. And even though some of those people went free, he still enslaved around a quarter of those people using indentured servitude and saying that they owed him money that they needed to work off, things like that. So even though coward John Randolph moved those enslaved people to Texas, he really waited to the last minute to do it. And he thought it would be a way to save his plantation and be able to keep enslaved people. And that did not work out for him, thankfully. So following the pattern of migration, I realized somewhere around halfway through their move to the West Coast that they most likely didn't enslave people or own any kind of significant piece of land like a plantation, because they wouldn't have abandoned it to keep migrating west to try to find better land or better opportunities. During this time, they would have stayed put. So this makes me think that no, they did not enslave people, but they were cheering on the people who did, which seems very fitting for the Kris Jenner Kardashian family. And the next part of my Righteous Kimstones series, The Devil Works Hard, Kris Jenner Works Harder, I'm going to be moving into the 1900s and talking more about Kris's more immediate family. So stay tuned for that. And thanks for your patience, everyone, as I research and put all of this information together, because there are a lot of different sources, but it feels like on Kris's side of the family, she's done a lot to either cover up, or maybe they weren't very interesting and didn't have a lot of information. But I'm having to piece things together historically and through genealogy online. Of course, this is all for entertainment purposes only, but I find it to be entertaining, and I hope you do too. So comment and please help me stay on the For You page if you like this content, and I will be back with more, I promise.